We live in a culture obsessed with self-affirmation, where every uncomfortable feeling must be validated, every impulse celebrated, every desire honored as sacred truth. The message echoes from every corner. You are enough. You are perfect as you are. Listen to your heart. Follow your instincts. We've built an entire industry around the idea that human nature is fundamentally good, that all we need is permission to express our authentic selves. But what if this comforting narrative is precisely what keeps us trapped in cycles of destruction? What if Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, spent decades uncovering a truth so disturbing that we've spent a century trying to bury it? Freud argued that beneath our civilized surface lies something primitive, chaotic, and fundamentally amoral. He called it the id, a reservoir of unconscious drives driven purely by pleasure, aggression, and self-gratification, with no concern for morality, consequence, or other human beings. Those who confronted this reality, who stopped pretending they were innately virtuous and began the uncomfortable work of examining their unconscious impulses, discovered something remarkable. They stopped repeating destructive patterns. They gained genuine self-control instead of the illusion of it. They understood why they sabotaged relationships, why success felt threatening, why they couldn't escape certain compulsions. The transformation wasn't about becoming good, it was about becoming conscious of what they actually were. In this video, we'll explore Freud's revolutionary and uncomfortable claim that human beings are not born good. We'll examine why acknowledging our darker nature is the only path to genuine psychological freedom. And we'll discover why the people who make real progress are those willing to confront the uncomfortable truth about what drives them beneath the surface of conscious awareness. Freud understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We are not the rational, moral creatures we pretend to be. Beneath the thin veneer of civilization, beneath our carefully constructed self-image, there exists a part of the psyche that operates on pure instinct, that knows nothing of good and evil, that cares only about immediate gratification. He didn't arrive at this conclusion through philosophy or moral judgment, but through years of listening to patients reveal, often against their own wishes, the true nature of their unconscious minds. The truth Freud uncovered was this: human infants are not born as blank slates waiting to be corrupted by society. They arrive as bundles of pure desire demanding immediate satisfaction without any capacity for empathy, morality, or consideration of others. The id, as Freud named this primal core of the personality, operates on what he called the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, when it wants it, regardless of consequences. Society doesn't corrupt us, it restrains something that was already there, something fundamentally self-centered and destructive. Consider the young professional who can't understand why every relationship ends the same way. They present themselves as kind, thoughtful, emotionally available, yet within months, they become controlling, jealous, suffocating. They don't see it happening. They genuinely believe they're acting out of love. But Freud would recognize what's actually operating: unconscious possessiveness, the infantile demand that the other person exist solely to satisfy their needs. The civilized language of love conceals the primitive demand of the id. You exist to please me. Or take the person who claims to value authenticity above all else, who prides themselves on speaking their truth without filter. What they call honesty, Freud would recognize as the id breaking through social constraints. The aggressive impulse, the desire to dominate, the pleasure derived from hurting others, all dressed up in the respectable clothing of authenticity. They're not being honest, they're being unrestrained, and they've convinced themselves this makes them enlightened. Freud observed that humans are fundamentally driven by two primary instincts: eros, the life instinct, manifested as sexuality and self-preservation, and thanatos, the death instinct expressed through aggression and destruction. These aren't metaphors or philosophical concepts. They're biological drives, operating beneath consciousness, shaping behavior in ways we rarely acknowledge. The person who claims they're not aggressive has simply repressed their aggression so deeply they've lost awareness of it, which makes it more dangerous, not less. Through years of clinical practice, Freud noticed a pattern in his patients. Those who made progress weren't the ones who maintained the illusion of their own goodness. They were the ones who could acknowledge with brutal honesty the destructive impulses they'd been denying. The man who recognized his unconscious wish for his father's death, the woman who admitted her sexual fantasies contradicted everything she claimed to value, the patient who confessed to deriving pleasure from others' suffering even while consciously believing themselves compassionate. What characterized the successful cases was their willingness to abandon the comfortable fiction of innate goodness. They stopped defending their unconscious motivations and started examining them. They recognize that consciousness is not the master of the house, but a small, often powerless observer trying to rationalize what the deeper forces have already decided. The ego, Freud explained, serves three harsh masters: the id demanding satisfaction, the superego demanding moral perfection, and external reality demanding survival. No wonder most people live in constant internal conflict. The illusion of progress comes from rearranging the furniture while leaving the foundation intact. People change their behaviors, adopt new belief systems, read endless self-help books, all while never touching the unconscious forces that generate the behaviors in the first place. They're like someone repainting a house while ignoring that the foundation is crumbling. Freud was interested in the foundation, the primitive structures that civilization can cover but never eliminate. What Freud proposed wasn't comfortable, it wasn't inspiring, it didn't affirm anyone's sense of self-worth, but it was, in his view, true. And the only path to genuine psychological freedom began with acknowledging that human nature is not inherently good, that morality is a fragile construction built on top of something much older and more powerful, and that the unconscious forces driving our behavior are often in direct opposition to what we consciously claim to value. The solution Freud offered wasn't to become good, because that was impossible. It was to become conscious, to drag into the light of awareness the drives and impulses that had been operating in darkness, not to judge them, not to eliminate them, but to recognize them, to understand their power, and to develop the psychological structure necessary to channel them in less destructive directions. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality of what that process actually requires. If this content is challenging your assumptions about human nature, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, because what comes next requires even more honesty about what lies beneath our civilized self-presentation. The process of making the unconscious conscious isn't a weekend workshop or a moment of insight. It's a sustained, often painful excavation of everything we've spent our lives burying. Freud didn't develop psychoanalysis as a quick fix or a path to happiness. He developed it as a method for confronting psychological reality, regardless of how uncomfortable that reality might be. And the reality he kept encountering across hundreds of patients was that the human psyche is structured around primitive drives that civilization can restrain but never eliminate. People often misunderstand Freud's concept of the id as simply representing base desires or animal instincts. But it's more fundamental than that. The id is the original psychic reality, the raw, unorganized energy from which all psychological development emerges. It operates in the realm of primary process thinking, where contradictions coexist, where time doesn't exist, where fantasy and reality are indistinguishable. When an infant screams for food, it's not making a rational request. It's expressing the id's demand for immediate satisfaction of a biological need. What makes this disturbing is not that we have these drives, but that they never truly evolve beyond this primitive state. The id remains infantile throughout life. What changes is not the id itself, but the development of the ego and superego psychological structures that attempt to mediate between the id's demands and the requirements of civilization. But make no mistake, Freud insisted, the id is always there, always demanding, always pushing for satisfaction. Every act of self-control is not the absence of destructive impulse, but the temporary restraint of it. Freud spent years, particularly between 1895 and 1900, developing the theoretical framework that would become psychoanalysis. This wasn't armchair philosophy. He conducted extensive self-analysis, examining his own dreams, his own unconscious material, confronting aspects of his own psyche that most people would find unbearable to acknowledge. He analyzed his feelings toward his parents, his sexual fantasies, his aggressive impulses, his death wishes toward people he loved. This wasn't noble or enlightened work. It was archaeological, digging through layers of repression to find what lay beneath. The period of Freud's self-analysis was marked by isolation and psychological discomfort. He wasn't surrounded by supportive colleagues affirming his journey. He was alone with material that threatened his own self-image, that contradicted everything his Victorian upbringing had taught him about human nature. Yet he persisted because he recognized that psychological truth mattered more than psychological comfort. The work demanded that he abandon the reassuring fiction that he, like everyone else, was fundamentally decent underneath his flaws. This process revealed something crucial. The more we insist on our own goodness, the more we're likely repressing. The person who constantly needs to prove they're kind is often defending against unconscious cruelty. The individual who loudly proclaims their lack of prejudice may be overcompensating for unconscious bias. The parent who insists they only want what's best for their children may be blind to how much of their parenting serves their own narcissistic needs. Freud would say these aren't exceptions, they're the rule. Consciousness is a liar, serving the ego's need for a coherent self-image rather than psychological truth. What emerged from Freud's confrontation with his own unconscious was a radical principle. Psychological health doesn't come from being good, it comes from being honest. Not the superficial honesty of admitting minor flaws while maintaining the fiction of fundamental decency, but the deep honesty of recognizing that morality is a precarious achievement, not a natural state. That every civilized behavior rests on the suppression of uncivilized impulses. That we're all capable of what we judge in others, given the right circumstances and sufficient erosion of inhibitions. For this approach to be effective, Freud realized several conditions were necessary. First, the analyst must have done their own deep psychological work, confronting their own unconscious material rather than projecting their unexamined drives onto their patients. Second, the patient must be willing to abandon defensive self-justification and engage with uncomfortable psychological reality. Third, the process must be sustained over time, not a quick fix, but years of careful excavation. And finally, both analyst and patient must accept that complete psychological health is impossible, that the best we can achieve is a less destructive relationship with our unconscious drives. This understanding leads to an uncomfortable realization about the nature of human development. We don't grow by becoming better people in some moral sense. We grow by becoming more conscious of what we actually are, which includes impulses we'd prefer to deny. The person who insists they have no aggressive impulses is more dangerous than the person who acknowledges their capacity for aggression and works to channel it constructively. Because unacknowledged drives operate with more power, not less, finding indirect expression in passive aggression, self-sabotage, and the thousand subtle ways we harm others while maintaining the fiction of our own innocence. But acknowledging this creates an immediate problem. Once you recognize that you're not fundamentally good, that your conscious intentions are often masks for unconscious drives, what happens to your sense of self? This is where most people retreat. They get a glimpse of their own unconscious material and immediately reconstruct the defensive walls that keep it hidden. They'd rather maintain a comfortable illusion than face uncomfortable truth. And Freud understood this resistance wasn't weakness, it was the ego doing its job, protecting the individual from psychological material they're not yet equipped to integrate. The question becomes, what happens when you stop retreating? When you remain present to the uncomfortable reality of your own psychological nature? This is where the real work begins, and it's nothing like the sanitized version of self-improvement we're sold. It's a confrontation with aspects of yourself you've spent your entire life denying, and that confrontation changes everything. In the stillness of genuine self-examination, something shifts. Not the dramatic transformation promised by self-help gurus, but something quieter and more disturbing. You begin to recognize patterns you've been blind to, not because they were hidden in some mystical way, but because acknowledging them would shatter your self-image. The conscious mind is remarkably skilled at not seeing what it doesn't want to see. And what it most doesn't want to see are the ways our unconscious drives contradict our conscious values. This is where Freud's method reveals its true nature. It's not about becoming a better person. It's about becoming a more honest one. And honesty, in this context, means recognizing that much of what we call our personality is actually a defensive structure, a set of psychological mechanisms designed to keep unconscious material from breaking through into consciousness. Every rationalization, every justification, every story we tell about why we did what we did, these are the ego's attempts to maintain coherence in the face of contradictory impulses. The psychological pain that emerges during this process isn't the pain of confronting trauma, though that's part of it. It's the pain of recognizing that you're not who you thought you were, that your motivations aren't as pure as you believed, that you've hurt people not despite your good intentions, but sometimes because of them, that your moral outrage at others' behavior often stems from projection, from seeing in them what you can't acknowledge in yourself. This is what Freud meant by making the unconscious conscious. It strips away the comfortable fictions we use to avoid psychological reality. Your mind will fight this process with everything it has. It will generate justifications, alternative explanations, reasons why this time is different, why your case is special, why the pattern doesn't apply to you. It will create distractions, urgent matters that demand attention, anything to avoid sitting with the uncomfortable recognition of your own unconscious drives. It will even weaponize your progress, turning insight into a new form of defense, a way of appearing self-aware while avoiding deeper examination. But if you persist, if you refuse to accept the easy explanations your conscious mind offers, something begins to emerge. Not comfortable insights or affirming realizations, but recognition of the primitive forces that have been shaping your behavior all along. You start seeing the id's influence in your choices, your relationships, your reactions to frustration. You recognize how much of your behavior is driven not by conscious decision, but by unconscious impulse-seeking expression through whatever channels it can find. Freud understood this with brutal clarity. The poor ego has a still harder time of it. It has to serve three harsh masters, and it has to do its best to reconcile the claims and demands of all three. These demands are always divergent and often seem quite incompatible. No wonder that the ego so frequently gives way under this task. We are not unified beings making rational choices. We are battlegrounds where different forces struggle for dominance, and consciousness is often the last to know which force has won. The function of psychological discomfort in this process is not to be overcome or eliminated. It's a signal that you're approaching material the ego has been defending against. When you feel that visceral resistance to a particular insight, when every part of you wants to dismiss or rationalize away what you're seeing, that's often precisely the material you need to examine. The discomfort isn't the obstacle, it's the compass pointing toward what needs to be confronted. As you sit with this discomfort rather than fleeing from it, insights begin to surface that restructure your understanding of yourself. You recognize the sexual undercurrents in relationships you thought were purely platonic. You acknowledge the aggressive pleasure you derive from others' failures. You see how much of your apparent generosity serves narcissistic needs for recognition and control. These aren't pleasant discoveries, but they're real. And reality, however uncomfortable, provides a firmer foundation for psychological development than comfortable illusions. The necessity of this discomfort reveals something about human development that contradicts our cultural narratives. We don't grow by feeling good about ourselves. We grow by confronting what we've been avoiding, by recognizing impulses we've been denying, by accepting that we're not the rational moral agents we pretend to be. The person who claims to have resolved all their unconscious conflicts has simply buried them deeper. The person who acknowledges ongoing struggle with primitive drives is paradoxically more psychologically developed. Consider Freud's metaphor of the psyche as an iceberg, with consciousness representing only the small visible portion above the water's surface. Most of our mental life, the vast bulk of what drives our behavior, exists beneath consciousness in the realm of the unconscious. We spend our lives navigating according to what we can see, never acknowledging that we're being pushed and pulled by massive forces beneath the surface. Making the unconscious conscious doesn't eliminate those forces, but it gives us some capacity to recognize their influence, to understand why we suddenly find ourselves in familiar destructive patterns despite our conscious intentions to behave differently. This process of recognition transforms not through inspiration but through disillusionment. You become disillusioned with your own goodness, with your capacity for rational self-direction, with the coherence of your conscious motivations. This isn't depression or nihilism, it's a more realistic assessment of human psychological functioning. And from this realistic assessment comes the possibility of genuine change, not through willpower or positive thinking, but through developing psychological structures capable of mediating between unconscious drives and civilized behavior in more effective ways. The transformation, when it comes, arrives quietly, not as a sudden enlightenment or dramatic breakthrough, but as a gradual shift in how you relate to your own impulses. You begin to recognize the id's demands without immediately acting on them. You notice aggressive impulses without having to express them or deny them. You acknowledge sexual attractions without either repressing them into symptoms or acting on them inappropriately. This is what Freud meant by the famous phrase, "Where it was, their ego shall be." Not eliminating the primitive drives, but developing enough psychological structure to mediate their expression. When you finally emerge from this process, you don't announce your transformation. There's nothing to announce. You haven't become a better person in the way that term is usually understood. You've become a more conscious one, more aware of the forces operating beneath the surface, less likely to be blindsided by your own unconscious material. You haven't transcended your nature, you've developed a more realistic relationship with it. The irony is that others may not recognize what's changed. They expect transformation to look like increased virtue, better behavior, more positive energy. What they often see instead is someone less defensive, less certain, less eager to claim moral high ground, someone who can acknowledge their capacity for what they judge in others, someone who doesn't need to maintain the fiction of fundamental goodness because they've developed a more nuanced understanding of human psychology. The people who do recognize the change are those who've done similar work themselves. They see someone who stopped performing virtue and started acknowledging complexity, someone who can discuss difficult psychological truths without either celebrating them or condemning them, someone who understands that we're all operating with primitive drives beneath a thin veneer of civilization, and that acknowledging this reality is more useful than denying it. The disturbing truth about this transformation is that it often makes you less popular, not more. People are invested in maintaining their psychological defenses, and your willingness to examine yours threatens theirs. Your refusal to pretend that human nature is fundamentally good challenges their carefully constructed self-image. Your comfort with psychological complexity creates discomfort in those who prefer simple moral narratives about good and bad people. But you return to the world anyway, not because you have wisdom to share, but because that's where life happens. You return with fewer illusions about human nature, including your own. You interact with others knowing that they, like you, are driven by unconscious forces they rarely acknowledge. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you realistic. You can see the id operating in social dynamics, in political movements, in supposedly rational discourse. And you're neither surprised nor particularly disturbed by it. This is simply how humans function. Freud's principle about transformation was clear. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. The conscious mind, the ego, is weak compared to the powerful forces of the id and the harsh demands of the superego. But it has one advantage: persistence. By continuing to examine, to question, to recognize patterns, consciousness gradually expands its territory. Not conquering the unconscious, but creating more space for awareness of unconscious processes. You stop needing to prove your development to anyone. The markers of psychological growth aren't visible achievements or behavioral changes that others can recognize and validate. They're internal shifts in how you relate to your own psyche, in your capacity to recognize unconscious material before it completely hijacks your behavior, in your ability to sit with uncomfortable psychological truths without immediately constructing defenses against them. This work is invisible to others and often feels insignificant to yourself, which is precisely why it's genuine. Think of it like this: the person who loudly proclaims they've overcome their destructive patterns is almost certainly performing for an audience, internal or external. The person who quietly acknowledges ongoing struggle with unconscious drives, who recognizes that psychological work is never finished, who can admit to regression without spiraling into self-condemnation, that person has actually made progress. Because they've stopped measuring themselves against an impossible standard of moral perfection and started working with the reality of their actual psychological structure. The effects of this inner work eventually manifest in the collective, but not in the way most people expect. You don't become a leader or a teacher in any traditional sense. You simply operate with less unconscious projection, less need to use others to manage your own psychological material, less certainty about moral superiority. And in a world where most people are still operating from unexamined defensive structures, this creates subtle shifts in group dynamics, small spaces where psychological honesty becomes possible. But here's what Freud understood that most people miss: this work never ends. You don't arrive at a state of psychological health where the unconscious stops operating, where primitive drives cease to influence behavior, where you transcend your biological and psychological nature. You simply develop more capacity to recognize what's happening beneath consciousness, to catch projections before they completely distort your perception, to notice when the id is pushing for expression through sophisticated rationalizations. The question that remains, the one Freud spent his entire career exploring, is whether we're willing to engage with psychological reality as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were. Whether we can acknowledge that civilization is a thin and fragile construction built on top of something much more primitive and powerful. Whether we can face the uncomfortable truth that we're not fundamentally good, that morality is an achievement requiring constant maintenance, and that unconscious forces will always be influencing our behavior in ways we rarely recognize. This is the work, not comfortable, not affirming, but real. And reality, however uncomfortable, is the only foundation for genuine psychological development. What unconscious drives are operating beneath the surface of your conscious intentions right now? What would you discover if you examined with brutal honesty the real motivations behind behaviors you've been justifying as necessary or virtuous? Freud believed that most people will never ask these questions, that they'll spend their entire lives maintaining defensive structures against uncomfortable psychological truths. He argued that genuine self-knowledge requires abandoning the comforting fiction of human goodness and confronting the primitive drives that actually motivate behavior. If this video challenged your assumptions about human nature or made you question the true sources of your own behavior, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human mind through Sigmund Freud. Until the next video.